Do you know the difference between poem, poet, and poetry? Ai azani jiawazi chia newan amushane Inglizi. Poem, poet, u poetry. These words make many students of English confused because they are so similar. Do you want to know how to remember them and to use them well? Vadas Bibikain, let's get started. Poem, poet, and poetry. 3 words that many of my students mix up. So let's define each word, and then we'll make a plan for how to remember them and use them correctly. First, a poem is a piece of writing that uses metaphor, rhyme, meter, and rhythm to describe something in a way that connects with your emotions. In Kurdish, poem is hondrawa. So what is a poet? A poet is a person, a kind of author who writes poems. In Kurdish, for poet, you say شاعیر. So a poet, the person, writes a poem, the piece of writing. Very good. So what is poetry? Poetry is the name of the kind of writing, the field of writing. Jori yan buari nusinaka. In the field of writing, you have different kinds of books. For example, you have history, meju. You have fiction, waku roman. And you have theology, waku ainzani. Poetry is just the name for this kind or type of writing. So, a poet writes a book of poems, and in the library, they put it in the poetry section. Recently, I made a video about the poem Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. The poet, the author, was named Robert Frost. And I found that poem in this book of poetry. Okay, so how can we remember which is which? The beginning of all of these words are the same, so let's use the endings of the words to remember what each one means. A poem is a piece of writing meant to connect with your emotions. Well, sometimes when you are feeling something deeply, you might make a sound. A poem makes you go, so beautiful. The M at the end of poem can help you to remember that poem is hondrawa, a beautiful piece of writing. A poet is the person who writes a poem. Poet ends in the letter T. The letter T sounds like the drink, tea. And who drinks tea or chai? People drink tea. So, when you see the T at the end of poet, you can remember that this is speaking of the person who wrote the poem. Last, how can we remember poetry? Well, the ending of the word poetry makes the sound tree. And this sounds like the English word for tree, which in Kurdish is dar or dracht. Think about how big trees are and how many branches they have. Like a tree, poetry is a very big field of writing, with many different authors and many different poems being written throughout history. So when you see the TRY, tree ending at the end of poetry, this can remind you of the picture of a tree. And you can remember that poetry means this field, this kind of writing. Fērbە. Now you know the difference between poem, poet, and poetry, and how to remember each one if you use it in conversation. If this was helpful for you, then you might be helped by another video about a very common mistake, saying nice to meet you when you should be saying nice to see you. Takaya seri video ishbika, chunka dilniam basud bet boto. Jawi mini fērbە. Until tomorrow, hata sabene. Khwafiz.